Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 where we are going to start going over advanced CSS. This is going to cover chapters 7.1 to 7.4 in your book. Here we go. Alright, so in this chapter, specifically in this lesson, because next week we'll be going over the rest of the chapter, we're going to learn about CSS layout using Flexbox and Grid. If you remember from CIS 195, we very briefly went over Flexbox and Grid. We're going to be going over it a little bit more in depth now. What responsive web design is and how to make it, how to use filters, transitions, and animations, and preprocessors. So those bottom two are going to be next week. Top two are going to be this week. So how did CSS used to work? Again, we kind of briefly mentioned this last term. The way that CSS used to work was we would use a display property, and that would either be block, so it's a block of content inline, which means that it flows in line with other content, or inline block, which means it would flow in line as a block of content. What those specifically mean, you don't really need to know. But what you do need to know is that for the first 20 years of CSS, which blows my mind that it's been around that long, there was no official way to do column layouts. So if you think about most layouts today, you have normally like a 4-column layout or 2-column, so you have your big chunk of stuff, and then off to the side you have another column. Before things like Grid or Flexbox, we had to fake it. You either built a table and put things as cells in that table, or you faked the column layouts using floats or positioning. We're going to go over what those are in just a minute. But it's important to know what these things are, because if you have to support older, which is what we call legacy CSS, it'll make more sense. Newer approaches are Flexbox and Grid. They are based on columns, so they making column layouts much easier. So here is float. So a floating element is taking an element out of its normal position and then reflowing it in a new position. You can either float left or float right, and then the rest of the content flows in around it. The way that you do that in CSS is you add in a float column right or float column left, and then you should also put a width with it, because and either like a strict, like explicit width in pixels, or a like an EM or percentage width, because otherwise it's not going to know how to reflow that content around it. So we have our 3 examples here. The first one is how it is just based in that element. So basically you have your 2 paragraphs, and then it's sandwiched in the middle. It's taking each thing as its own block level thing. The next one down is implementing a float left, so it forces that picture to the left and then forces everything else to reflow around the right of it. The bottom example is the same thing, floated right, but with a margin of 10 pixels. So the margin says that you can't get anything closer to the edge of that than 10 pixels. It adds that comfy visual space that we're always looking for as designers, that make things more readable and make our site more usable. Positioning elements. So positioning is another way to stick things where we want to stick them. Positioning is top, left, bottom, right. You're kind of doing the top, left, bottom, right things already with things like border or margin or padding. The way with CSS, it's the way that is laid out. If you have 4 values, it's top, right, bottom, left, from left to right. There are different types of positioning that you can use. Absolute means that it is positioned there. So think about it in terms of editing a Word document. So if you have it like anchored in a position, that's what it means. It means that it is not going to move no matter the normal flow of the page or the size of the page. So be very careful with that, because think about the fact that even though you set things absolutely positioned, it may not fit the screen if someone's using a smaller screen. Fixed is fixed in a position in the window even when the document is scrolled. That's what we use to create parallax layouts. So when you have a layout where you're scrolling down but the background is staying in the same spot, that's called parallax. It's kind of a cool design thing. It was really popular a couple of years ago. It's still kind of in use. Relative means that it should be moved to where it would normally be, like relatively. Makes sense, right? Right. Static is the default, so it is positioned according to the normal flow of the page. Where it goes, it goes. Sticky is positioned according to the normal flow and then offset. Basically, it makes it to where an item can scroll and then stay fixed when the scroll position is reached. Very kind of a niche use. Not really something you ever have to worry about. Again, these are legacy ones. These are not ones that are in use really in the field anymore. But make sure that you're familiar with them if you ever have to look over somebody's site. So this is an example of relative positioning. The first one is your default. So it is positioned relative, or it's statically positioned, because remember, static is the default, between the two paragraphs. The next one is a relative position relative to the top of the next element. So that would be that paragraph, 150 pixels down, and then 200 pixels to the left of that left, basically margin side of the window. So it completely changes the flow of the page. And also notice that it is completely covering up the text in that area. This is absolute positioning. So instead of going by the elements, it is going by the window. So from the top of the window, it's going 150 pixels down. From the right of the window, it's going, from the left window, it's going 200 pixels over. Think about it as your top default is that top left corner. And again, it completely covers up that text. It's not reflowing, because that's what we do with float. It is putting it, bam, like a sticker. Which brings us to overlapping and hiding elements. So you notice that when we just went over, it was covering up those elements. You may need to place two elements on the top of each other. So instead of using a figure caption here, it's positioning that label over the picture. The way that you do that is to use absolute positioning. So you set the figure, so your picture itself, or the figure element, as the relative, basically the anchor point, yeah? And then it sets the position as absolute relative to that anchor point. So position relative is creating that anchor, which is what they're calling the positioning context. Figure caption, that position absolute, is moving it according to that anchor. Okay? Now this is assuming that this example here is assuming that you have two elements that are of the same size. This is just a cool way of showing that you can layer elements on top of each other What they've done is taken this new banner.png. It's transparent underneath everywhere but the border and where it says new, and then positioned it over it, and then hid it in the next one. So display none hides an element. Okay? The preferred way to do it is by doing display none. The even more preferred way to do it is by making a CSS class that's like hide or hidden or no view, whatever you want to call it, and then sticking that as display none, and then adding that to your class list for your elements. So down here at the bottom, you actually have your image tag down here where it's got the image source, new banner.png, class, overlaid, which is your positioning class, and then hide. The reason for that is that you can use JavaScript to remove and add classes. We did that last term. Again, sorry, I'm going to keep referencing it, but I'm wanting to tickle those memories. But you can remove and add that hide class to toggle a show and hide. Think about any sort of accordions you've seen. Those are basically show hide toggles. Okay, so now we're going to start going over Flexbox layouts. Flexbox is really, really cool. Basically, what we would have to do is pre-Flexbox, we would have to use floats and margins to fake columns. And we would have to be extremely cognizant of the sizes of all of our images and elements so that we could explicitly set those margins to make sure things were falling in the needed area. So if the image size changed, or if you needed to use it in several places, or you wanted to use separate images, you would have to know that and change it. Super annoying, right? Well, Flexbox has a much more generalized, which means that it's much more reusable way of doing that. And we'll go over it here. Important things to notice on this, which we'll go over in depth, are display flex is how you declare something as a Flexbox layout, and then align items is how you align items. Okay, so this is showing flex container. So once you've set a flex box, you are creating a flex container that contains flex items. So if you think about it as a box, your flex container is your box, and then your items are the stuff that you put in that box. So within the flex box itself, the flex container, there is a main axis and a cross axis. So the main axis is that left to right axis. It's the, I'm probably going to get this wrong. It's the X axis. And then the cross axis is the Y axis. So this is important for your aligns. Okay. So remember, main axis, cross axis. Also, how we went over block level and inline level elements. So block levels create new lines basically whenever they're declared, and then inline don't. They just keep going. Both of those become an item. So be aware of that. Okay. So we have our flex direction here. The way that you, like I said, the way that you declare your flex box is display flex. So that's the first thing you're going to have. And then you're going to either do, if you want to change the default, you're going to do either row or row reverse. So that is your main axis. So your left or right axis. Row goes left to right. Row reverse goes right to left. And then your flex direction column means that things are going to lay out on that Y axis, so vertical, up and down. And the default is top to bottom, unless you do column reverse, and then it's bottom to top. So if you think about it like a table, your rows go left to right, and your columns go up and down. So if you do flex direction row, left to right, column up and down. The other important thing is wrap, and that decides whether or not when you reach the end of your window, that edge, whether or not it should continue on or it should flip down. The default is wrap. It's very rare to use no wrap, but if you need to make sure that it doesn't break on a new line, that's what you're going to use. Okay. So within the Flexbox container, we have a couple of properties that is important to know. The flex start and flex end denotes where the first item is going to sit. So if you do justify content flex start, justify content is going to be where it sits. So flex start means that it's going to start at that upper left and then go left to right, because remember, default is row. Yeah. And then align items is going to be your columns. So flex start, top left. Flex end it's going to take that last item and put it at the very end of your container. So and then fill in and still in that left to right direction to the left. So if you think about it as the dark blue is 1, the middle blue is 2, light blue is 3, it starts with laying down 3 and then is like 2, 1. Center means that it finds the center point, slaps that center item there, and then puts around the next ones relative to that. Space between figures out the leftmost, rightmost, and midmost, and equal spaces. The more you add, the more it has to add in. But it is equidistant between them. Space around, the difference is that it adds in a space at the beginning and at the end. So it's equal space, item, equal space, item, equal space, item, on and on and on. And then justify content stretch means that it's stretching everything to fit. So it's basically what we do a lot with menus, but it's stretching to fill that container, but takes as many items as you have and then still makes them equal size within it. So justify content is along that main axis. Align items is on your cross axis, so up and down. Same thing. So you got your flex start. It's going to start at that upper left. Flex end. It's going to start at the end of your container. Now I'm assuming that you're using just the default, so either row or column. If you're using the reverse, obviously it's going to be a different start and end point. Center, same thing, space around, space between, and then stretch. You don't have to memorize these. They are all on our handy dandy W3 schools, and then also any sort of documentation. So the Firefox CSS documentation has really good ones as well. Okay, so I don't know if we've gone over this or if you've heard about it in other classes, but there's a concept that we need to introduce here, and that concept is child-parent relationships. No, we are not doing therapy in class. Yes, I know that is a bad joke. Basically, your parent item is in your hierarchy, that up item, and then the child is anything under it. So in your Flex container is your parent, and then your child are your items. Okay? So the Flex basis of it, and again, these are all CSS declarations. is determines the initial size of the item before the space is distributed. Because remember, we do it by equal spacing with Flexbox. Everything is equally spaced apart. So auto means that the size is determined by the width and height of the child. You can also specify an explicit amount using FlexSpaceIt. And then you can also use FlexGrow. So FlexGrow 2 sets, basically the example here is it's taking the width of 1 and setting it as in. And then you want to FlexGrow the second one to 2. So it's taking that in value, timesing 2, and then setting it to the width. So 2 is twice the width of the other ones. And then Flex Shrink determines how much it's going to shrink when there's not enough space in the container. So if you have a higher Flex Shrink value, when things shrink down, those are going to be given higher priority in terms of width. One thing that you can do with Flex is make card layouts. So card layouts are all the rage right now. How Canvas is laid out, so when you log in and you've got your dashboard and your dashboards are different classes, those are Flexbox cards. So the way that it works is basically they're little tiny divs within them, and you don't have to build them this way. You don't have to have a footer in them. You don't have to have, an H3 in them. But basically they're creating that parent div of card as a container. So that's, if you look on the right where it says display flex direction column. So if you remember right, column goes top to bottom. So they're saying that within that div, everything is going to flex and it's going to be a column. And then it's saying the content within them. So there's a div within the div, and that content is flexing 1, 1, and auto. So remember, since it's columns, it's going to do equal space of 1, 1, and then set that last one to whatever's left, right? So the thing about that is that it sets the auto to the bottom, right? So it's going to float it all down. That's the problem that they're trying to solve in this. You'll notice it creates a little bit of a weirdness with the Albert Hall versus the Florence Duomo, because you have a wide versus a tall picture. But it is what it is. That's why when you're creating things like card layouts and stuff, it's good to have a like a thumbnail size or an image size that's standard that you crop all your images to. So we've gone over Flexbox. Now we're going to go over Grid. So grid layouts are my favorite, but you use them both together. You don't have to use just one or the other. They are very powerful when used together. Grid layouts are so much better than using floats and positionings. One thing about floats that I forgot to mention before was that if you have an item that's floating, you have to clear all your floats before you would try to center anything or float anything else. And it didn't work great. It was awful to use. It's not good. So, grids. So each block level child, so remember, we have block content and we have inline content. Blocks are things like divs, paragraphs, not really, images. Yeah, images. And then inline are things like spans. So block level content is going to be placed in a grid cell. So imagine it like putting a big piece of graph paper on your website. What we have here is a grid container. So you display, the way you declare it is you do display grid. So far for displays, we've seen display none to hide things, display grid to create a grid, display flex to create a flex box. You may have also seen display inline or display block. And then to add that comfy little visual space in between each grid cell, they've added a gap, and that gap is 10 pixels. So here are how you denote your grid structure. So when you're laying out your grid, you got to kind of tell it how to build it. So you do that by adding columns, and you add columns by adding a FR unit. FR is equal to, it just means fraction, right? So in the layout here, you are setting up your columns by saying, hey, I want my columns to be 3, and I want them to be equal fractions of the space. So you have a 3-column layout here. They're all equally spaced and equally sized. You can do the same thing with rows. So what they've done here is, instead of doing fractions, they've set it explicitly as a pixel. So the grid template rows are set as 80 pixels high for the top one, 30 pixels for the second row down, and then 50 pixels. That's why they're different heights. If you do that, you can make your content to where it is, you need to make your rows bigger than your content if you're setting it explicitly. Otherwise, it is going to not work correctly, in that your content is going to flow out of your grid and it's not going to look correct. So I highly recommend using the FRs. Okay. So instead of having to write them out, you can use repeat instead. So here is the example they have of setting things up explicitly. So grid template columns, the first one's 70 pixels wide, next one's 70 pixels, next one's 45. You can do the same thing. Well, you can't, if you're setting your columns explicitly, if you're using pixels, you can't use repeat. If you're using, no, you can. Just don't. You can, but don't. Repeat makes it easier for things like the fractions. You can get really in depth with it and maybe play around with it, but don't get yourself confused. Basically, to set up a 3-column layout, which is what the bottom left example is showing, they are doing, you have your grid template columns that's saying I'm working on my columns. Repeat, which means that it's doing a repeating pattern. It's going to do 3, and they're each going to be 1 fraction. The next example over, and this is what I mean about it can be confusing. So it's saying do a repeating pattern of 2, do the first column of 30, the next column of 50, and then outside of that repeat, at the last one, do a 70. So you end up with a 5-column layout of 30 and then 50, so that's the first repeat, 30 and then 50, that's the second repeat, and then the last one 70. You can also use auto in there, and that's just going to figure out what the remaining space is and set it to that. Okay, here is another way to do it. This is using autofill and min-max. So autofill fills the row with as many columns as it can fit into the space. And then the min-max is The minimum, so the minimum is the first before the comma, maximum is after the comma. Okay? So it's saying, I want you to put as many columns in this space that are minimum 100 pixels wide that are equally sized. So if you have 560 pixels as your width with a minimum of 100 pixels, you can't go really any bigger than that. So it's going to fill it with 5 columns of 100, and then you're going to have a 60 pixel space. So that's autofill. Okay? So fill goes as many will fit, but not filling the space necessarily. Autofit is the same kind of thing, but it will fill the available space. So it's saying fit as many columns in here, but they need to at least be as wide as 100 pixels. And they need to be equally sized. So I believe that works out to being 112 pixels wide each. So it's a 560 width space. They need to be at least 100 pixels wide. 112 is what fits in there. And again, you got to have repeat in there first. So these are just some examples of different grid structures and how they work. The one that the KCC website uses is the Bootstrap 4 approach. So Bootstrap is a JavaScript library that you can just kind of call in your stuff, and then it's already got all the stuff set up. So Bootstrap is 12 column based, so, or can be 12 column based. Ours is set up to be 12 column based, but basically what you have in there is that, and it's explicitly calling it, you don't have to in your actual doing it if you use Bootstrap, but it's laying out your container for the whole page or for that section. And then within the container, you set explicitly rows, and then it'll do columns within that rows. The reason that it did it with div class call is that it's showing you that the difference. The CSS grid approach is just declaring your container and then declaring your container, like your container childs, as display block in there, because images are an inline element. Okay, so that is before we looked at our grid, creating it, and then just letting stuff live where it wanted to live within our grid, but which is called implicit, which means it's just going to lay where it lays, right? So with it, it's going to start on the left, fill to the right till it can't anymore, start a new line. So that's the example 1, top, right? Not the where it says example 1, but the top right. And then let's say we want things to be in certain spots. So the way that you do that is by using grid columns, and then either grid column start, grid column end, or spans. So this is telling A that it needs to start on 1 and then end when it touches that 3 line. So fill that. And then the other ones lay out as needed. You can also do it the same way with a shorthand of grid column 1/3. That's basically a shorthand of before the 1 or before the slash is your grid column start. After the slash is your grid column end. The bottom one is saying start at 1 and then span 2. So instead of saying end at 3, it's saying take up 2 cells. So here is another example So again, we have our implicit layout up on the top right. Now, what's different about this is that you'll notice that the B is not where it usually is, right? So it's told it explicitly to go to row 2, so that's that bottom row, column 2. And then the rest of it flows around it. So A, we've already set A to start at 1 and end at 3. And it's going to move B down and be like, okay, what's the next thing? So then C, D, E. Within the grid cell, so within the A, the B, the C, within any of those little blue cells, you can affect how the content of that sits. So remember, align self and justify self. You're using the axes again. So horizontal and vertical placement. If you want to fill the whole cell, you're going to use stretch for both. If you're going to want to have it fill it vertically, that's when you use align self. If you're wanting to adjust the horizontal, that's when you use justify self. Okay, so align self is vertical, justify self is horizontal. The way that you adjust it is by using either stretch, center, or end. It's really easy to align your items to the center using this. Before this, you had to use a margin auto, which was why you had to use a float clear or clear float. Because if you have floated items and then you try to set a margin auto to where it's auto figuring out what margins are on either side of it, it gets confused and then you can't center items. Can you have a grid within a grid? Yes, you can absolutely have a grid within a grid. You can have as many grids and as many grids as you want. You can have a flex box within a grid. You can have a grid within a flex box. This is just an example of it. So our main, so what's outlined in blue is the main, and it is set to a grid. So that is your first grid. It's set to a 2-column layout of 1 fraction and then 4 fractions. So you're setting up your next grid in your first grid using this, if that makes sense. So it's a 2-column, but also it's a 5-column, right? So it's a 2-column 5 fraction, if that makes any more sense. And then within that, we've got a section, right? So that is another grid. So we've said display grid. We want to have a 1 EM gap, so that is basically a percentage of the font size of it. And then it's setting your columns to auto fit, so not auto fill. So if there's space on the side, it is not auto fill. It has a minimum of auto fit and a maximum of 220 pixels. No, apologies. I don't use auto fit a lot. I need to... Boop. Okay, it's not using min-max. It's just saying auto fit as many 220 pixels in there as you can. So grid within a grid. Easy to make a card layout. Within those, I'm betting they are using a flex card to create those individual little layouts. This is just an example of using grid areas to explicitly set out a grid. So they have fully laid out this page here. Now they're doing it as a class. So the way that you set it up is you create your template, so your grid template areas, and it's done that. So the period is a blank. That's why there's none there. It's just a placeholder. And then we have an A1 through A4. Then the next row we have B2 through B3, or sorry, B1 through B3. Again, this is a 5-column layout. So it's saying B1, and then B2 fills up 3 of those columns, and then B3. And then B1 is taking up 2 rows, and then C1, and then C2. And what they've done after they've set up their template is you set up grid areas to classes, and then you apply those classes to your divs. So you set up your template with your areas, and then you tell your classes what area is applied to what class, and then you tell your div what class to be. That's how they set the colors. This is just a further example of it, showing that your naming convention doesn't have to be any sort of sense making. It's just you lay out your template. So this one, they've filled the whole space. The one on the right, you can see that there are 2 dots on the bottom. That's just a placeholder again. So yeah. Like I was saying, you can use Grid and Flexbox together. Grid and Flexbox are super cool together. Grid is lay out the structure of your page. Flexbox is laying out the content within your cell, your grid cell. So that's how these set up these lovely little image cards here. You'll notice in the back end where you can barely see it because the other window is overlapping it, they're all not the same height. So what Grid does is it demarks it out into nice little columns, so everybody plays nicely in terms of like width. And then what Flex does is that it's controlling that height to where they're equal heights, so that they're flexing down a column, so top to bottom. They're aligning the images to center, so align self center is going to adjust within that container. And then the button is setting it to the bottom with justify self flex end, so it's going to stick it to the bottom. And then align self center, it's going to stick it to the middle in terms of that horizontal space. Okay, so the last thing we're going to go over this week is responsive design. And then next week we're going to go over effects and preprocessors. I apologize if you hear me swallowing. My throat's a little dry because holy crap, I've been talking a lot. Okay, so responsive design. Basically what that means is that it responds to changes in your browser size. So basically it's reflowing the content based on the size of your screen. So I don't know how old you all are, but there was a time in the wild, wild west where when you looked at a website on your phone that just barely had internet on it, it was the same as the website that you looked at on your computer. And you tried to click stuff, and it was awful because everything was too small and the images would float off the screen because the width was wacky. So responsive design has been really excellent for usability. What it does is not only does it give smaller images, it also changes the layout and navigation elements. So instead of going from your normal navigation, it goes to, either a drop down or the hamburger button, which is the 3 lines, or the dots. My KCC does this. In my opinion, doesn't do too terrible good of a job with it, but there's very little customizing that I can do for it. Our website does it pretty good. It goes to the hamburger button. so that when you get on a small phone, you click that, it expands down the menu. The way that you do this, by the way, is by using grid and then also using viewports. We're going to go over that a little bit. So, mobile first design. Basically what it means is that when mobile phones first started being a thing, designing for mobile phones was an afterthought or not thought of at all. Mobile first means that, hey, we're going to plan out how this design is going to work on a small screen first, and then build our site around that. So it makes it more accessible, right? It also kind of makes you really be mindful about your content and how your content should be laid out and what's important content and what content can be hidden and only accessed when needed. Okay, so this is an important concept. Viewports. They are the part of the browser window that it displays content. So, not every phone viewport, like not every phone screen, the viewport goes all the way to the end. But basically the viewport is the window displaying content. Mobile browsers will automatically scale it down to fit the width of the screen, no matter how it's going to look. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the bad old days of pre-mobile first web design. So it's taking that and shrinking it down to the mobile browser screen, not thinking about if somebody could even read it. So, viewports. When you create your website, in your meta, you can set a viewport in it. So the width attribute is the size of the viewport, and the initial scale is the zoom level. So in the example here, this is setting the width to device level, or sorry, device width. So the content is going to be device width, and then the initial scale is going to set it to 1, meaning that it is fitting the width of the viewport, and then not scaling it because it's setting the scale of 1 of what it had before. So no scaling if you set it to 1. Why is viewport important? Because that is how we attack it with CSS to make it look different. We do that by using a media query. So CSS media queries apply rules based on what's displaying it. Okay? When you lay out your CSS, you have your CSS rules for phone displays generally first. Honestly, that's part of the mobile first layout, like design philosophy, because cascading style sheet, right? What that actually means is it's going to cascade down from top to bottom. So if it hits that mobile first, that's why it's there. So we use that, the way that we declare in our CSS is at media. The rest of it, you will not use all of the options all of the time, but it's good to know what they are. Okay, so it's saying at media, so this is saying it's a media query only, which is basically in programming logic the same as an and statement, but in this case it's saying only do this if the conditions after this are both true. If you don't have the only in there, which you don't necessarily have to add, if one or the other are true, then it will do it. So it's saying this media query will only work if the device is a screen, that is what screens mean, and it has a maximum width of 480 pixels. So it's only going to work if it's a screen and the width of the viewport, which is again the browser that shows web content, the width of that on your device is no wider than 480 pixels. And then you have your regular CSS declaration. So you write your class rules within that, your class and your IDs and your all of those, your declarations within those brackets. This helps it be a little bit more concrete, right? Okay, so they have set out their rules, mobile first, and then tablets, because we can't forget our tablet friends, and then desktops, laptops, blah, blah, blah. So if we look at our rules here, we have all of them start with @media query, right? Only work if it's a screen and the max width is no bigger than 480 pixels. If that's true, make the ID slider image, the max width of it, make it take up the whole screen. And then the flash add, whatever ID they've set to that, turn it off. Okay? For tablets, you set a minimum and a maximum width. So it's saying, make this happen only if it's a screen and it is minimum of 480 pixels, so no smaller than 481, and maximum no bigger than 768. So if that screen is between this and this, then do this. And then the last one is everything else. So make it work only if it's a screen and if it has a minimum width of 469 pixels. So if it is 469 pixels or bigger, this is how it looks, right? Cool. You can also not explicitly lay out the rules for desktops. Okay. You can also make separate rules in different files. That's if you have a holy cow bunch of CSS rules. Otherwise, in general, just make them in the same file. And then what I do is, like, because you can have for whatever CSS classes, you can have like different media queries in there and they don't have to be all the same. But in general, just have one for your mobile and then one for your tablet and make all of your rules in there. Okay. Here's the thing. When you are scaling down an image, it does not change the file size of the image, so the download, if they download it, but it does change how it looks displayed. So this image here is set to max width of 100, means it's going to take up 100% of that side to side of it. But it's not going to change, like we looked at in our lab last week, the actual image size in pixels when you download it. There's also a new element that lets you use multiple image elements within it. This is really good for setting different images for different viewport sizes. Okay, so this is very cool. Still kind of new thing, but very cool. So what it's saying is, within this picture, so no matter what, there's going to be a picture there. You use source media if it is minimum of 960 pixels wide this is the source that we're going to use. The next one, well, is it minimum 480 pixels wide? Then this is the one that we're going to use. And then otherwise, use this one. So the image, alt, and then source. That bottom one is your default. And then goes up. Okay? So instead of building bigger down, you're building smallest up. So your default should be your smallest, and then it should look for the next size up, and then it should look for the next size up. All right. That is the end of this lesson. We have a lab this week that is going over responsive design. Basically, you are taking something that is not responsive and making it responsive. It is incredibly important to learn this concept. So if you have any questions, please make sure to put it on the... Wow, I almost said Discord. Hey, let me know, y'all, if you want a Discord for this class, and I'll set one up. But otherwise, put it on the help thread, because it's really helpful for other people who might have the same question. There you go. Let me go back so you're not staring at a blank screen. Other than that, read your chapter. This is 7.1 to 7.4. There is the slides for this if you want to follow along at home. And then, yeah, you got the lab for the week. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to y'all next week. Thanks. Bye.